Okay, so here's how to make a fractured mesh in Blender. Export it to Godot and get it working in Godot. First of all, you'll need a actual mesh that you'll want to break. In this case, I made this building or building piece. First, you have to make sure that it's in the origin of your scene. Go to Object Properties, make sure it's at a proper location. In this case, this is too low, even though the pivot for the model is in the center. I'll just move it up a bit, and there we have it. So notice I made this folder structure with one of which is called high and the other one's called low. I'm going to be generating 2 pieces for low and 4 pieces for high. This is because my game actually will be compiled for both HTML and Windows. HTML can't handle as many pieces, so I'd like my blocks to be fewer pieces. And as for Windows, you can export as many pieces as you like, up to a reasonable amount. You might be wondering if I can export this mesh with vertex paint or actual textures. As for that, I cannot provide any instruction because I don't know how to do it. So for now, all I'm doing is just exporting the pieces of the mesh and then adding a material to them in Godot. So that means a plain material, a single colored material, or whatever else you can add to it in Godot itself. The UVs for this model will obviously be a huge mess, so I'm just focusing on the breakable mechanic. Okay, so let's get this model fractured. For starters, select the model and hit F3 with the cursor on top of it and search for cell fracture. If you don't have cell fracture, go to Edit, Preferences, and make sure the cell fracture add-on is installed. So back to cell fracture. These settings should be fine for you. So just copy them. And as for source limit, you can do either 2 or 4 like I had planned, or you can set 20 or even 100, as many as you feel like doing and your hardware can actually handle. So I'll start with 2 for my low setting, hit OK, and this has generated 2 blocks. It doesn't seem to have broken my original mesh, but it put it in the high folder, which wasn't intentional really. If I'd selected first the low folder and then selected the mesh we wanted to fracture and hit F3 and applied the modifier, these two would have been placed in the low folder, which would have been more organized. But anyway, in this case, this hasn't worked properly, so we just select one of them with shift and click, one of the pieces, and go to the modifier properties, and then hit fast for the boolean. Now we can see it actually did generate a mesh piece. Since we have the 2 pieces selected, we can Control L and hit copy modifiers. This way, this modifier that we just changed for the first piece will be applied to the second one. Now right click on top of the pieces, hit convert to mesh. Now we got the pieces, but we'll probably notice that there's some edges, some straight edges around the model. You can actually get rid of these, but I actually don't really care much about them. They won't have any negative effects in game. So if you notice any negative effects or you have any issue with them, you can just remove them. Now let's try the same, but with further pieces. Just 4 in my case. Hit OK. And of course, I forgot to set the proper folder again. Make sure you have all of them selected and then select the one that's not right. Hit the solver fast and then Control L, copy modifiers. Now right click, convert to mesh. And you'll see, of course, you might not like the pieces that have been generated. You can just move them around to make sure. In my case, I'm happy with this. It is a bit of a mess because of all the stray edges that are around, but in my case, it doesn't really affect the gameplay. You can, of course, try to select them and then delete them. But of course, depending on the amount of pieces that you have, this might be inconvenient. In order to export, select the pieces that you want to export and none other. Then go to File, Export, and select GLTF 2.0. You can hit the Remember Export settings so that it remembers for the next time. Include limit to selected objects, very important. Make sure the Y is up for correspondence with Godot. In Godot, the Y-axis is the up axis. As for the mesh, make sure you preserve the normals in case that you're actually interested in the lighting to bounce off your model properly. My game's a low poly game, so all I'm interested in is the normals really. I just add the material later. No material, lighting isn't important, and no animations. So I have it all ready. Now I already exported one like this, so I'll just overwrite it. And the same for the low, or for the single model that you've actually fractured. And of course, we'll also want to export a base building piece, in my case a base building, which is the whole part of the building. Basically a version of the building that isn't fractured, the original model. So just select that one and export it also as a GLTF. Good. And that's it for the Blender part. Now in Godot, if you're organized, you have your GLB files in the proper folders. And now we can just work with them. I now made a new scene, which is going to be a Area 3D base node, which will have our building F1 in my case. We'll make local. So we can just get the mesh from in here and delete the root 3D node. Now we're going to add a collision shape 3D to our mesh so that when something collides with it, it will be replaced for the fractured mesh. So basically the collision will serve as a collision detection for this purpose. We can do it two different ways. First would be selecting the mesh, then clicking this button here, mesh, and create single convex collision sibling. I could just do that, and that would do. But this shape is kind of simple, so we can just do this with a cube, which would be more optimal. So I'll just delete the collision shape I just created, and instead of that, just add a child node and select a collision shape 3D. Select the shape as a new box shape, and in the transform, make sure you are setting the appropriate dimensions for your glider. Make sure the mask is set to the appropriate mask for the objects in which layer you want the collision to work with. This is a script that the base Area 3D node has attached to it. What it basically does is it references the high fractured resource and the low fractured resource, which are basically the two resources that will replace this resource once a collision is detected. So basically, what's going on here is a signal is being sent when a collision is detected on body entered. And this signal points to the on body entered method, which is on the script. And it loads the high fractured resource or low fractured resource, depending on the platform we are running the game on. Then the position, the rotation, and the scale of this newly instanced packed scene is applied so that it is exactly the same as our original base mesh. Finally, the original base mesh is deleted, and only the fractured one remains. I'll leave a link to this script in the description below. It's basically part of my Meteorite Golf project. Also, if you click the area node with the script attached to it, you'll see here's where we would attach the high fractured resource and the low fractured resource, which are these packed scenes. And now I will show you how to configure these two resources. Okay, so the fractured models will start in a scene with a 3D node asset space with a script that I got from user named RedVilusion on YouTube. So I basically copied his script and fixed it for Godot 4. Basically what it does, he will explain better, is it has a few functions. One of them sets the material for the shards that we will add later. One of them activates and deactivates the physics service for Godot. This one saves all the shard positions. This one resets the positions to its original saved shard positions. And this one creates the rigid bodies for each of the shards when we're setting it up. So go for the fractured model that is 4 pieces in this case, which is building a fractured high, and place it inside the shards node. So yeah, you have to have this hierarchy with the base node with the script and a shards node because the script actually references this child node. Now make local the node tree that we just added and move each of these meshes, the individual fractured meshes, outside to the shards node and delete the original base node. Now we have all of our shards, but of course they need to be inside a rigid body and they need a collider for them. So for this, the script that I mentioned comes in handy. We just have to select it and hit. For starters, you might want to save the shard positions if you're simulating this in a separate scene, and then create the widgets. Finally, you can set the material. In my case, I added this material target so you don't have to hard code this string, and you can just target the material you want to add to each of your pieces. This comes in handy because if you have a lot of pieces, you might not want to do that manually. So set the material. In this case, it seems it doesn't find it. Yes, well, this error basically means that the name couldn't be found. So I basically changed all my material names, and I'm not surprised I couldn't find it. So just put the proper name for the material, material underscore 5 in this case, and set material. And there you go. Of course, I also forgot to set the material for the base mesh that will be replaced. So we'll just add the same material to the base node, and keep in mind there are no shards here, so we just have to drag and drop the material on top of it. We could already add this fractured resource as the high fractured resource for the building base, like so. And now we can go and create the low fractured resource. But of course, you might not want any of this and just add one type of fracture, depending on whatever platform you're planning on building for. Some platforms will stand higher amounts of fractures, and some other platforms will stand lower amounts. Okay, so here I am with the low fractured version of the model. I'll just add the low mesh, make it local, extract the meshes, delete the base node, go to the root node. You can get the shard positions, but I don't really use this feature very much, so I'll just create rigids and make sure the material is okay and hit set material. There we go. Now I'll just add the fractured low to the base building. Well, that is all we need to know for the technical Blender and Godot part. So I made this scene where I put a bunch of fractured props. I varied the colors for them. As you can see, each one of them has different fractured variants in different colors. I also made this bridge, which doesn't necessarily need a box collider to trigger its fractured variants. Instead, it's just using a convex polygon shape 3D, which I added by just clicking on the mesh and clicking then mesh and create single convex collision sibling. Finally, since my game is about destroying things with a meteorite, I added a meteorite rigid body, which is in collision layer 2. So thanks to this, these buildings which have mask in layer 2 will only collide against this meteorite or any other rigid body which is in the same mask. Keep that in mind.